Today we're going to be looking at Genesis chapter 27, and I've entitled this lesson, A House Divided. Divided not only between brother and brother, but as you will see, the parents even get in on the conspiring, or one parent in particular. But before we get into chapter 27, I would like to skim over Genesis chapter 26, which comes as in part from the Yahwist source. The majority of it is from the Yahwist source, with the very end, that bit that tells you who Esau married, these two Hittite women, comes from the priestly source. And if you read it, you will know that it mirrors two similar, nearly identical stories found back in Genesis chapter 12, when Abraham found himself in Egypt, comes from the Yahwist source, and Genesis chapter 20, when Abraham found himself with this exact same Philistine king, Abimelech, which comes from the Elohist source. There is one notable exception, however, namely Rebecca in today's story, or the one we're skimming over in brief, is not taken into the king's harem. Isaac tells everyone that she is his sister, but she is not taken into any harem. And other than this detail, the story follows similar patterns. The patriarch is used. The patriarch uses his wife as cover, saying she is his sister. The foreign king takes the moral high road and deals honestly and graciously with the patriarch. That seems to be the pattern with these stories. Isaac's prosperity, if you read on, in Gerar, leads to his expulsion. He is asked to leave because he's becoming too powerful. Genesis 26, 12 through 16. Then there is this dispute over wells where Isaac's shepherds and servants keep digging new wells, as each well they dig, or actually uncover, a well from Abraham's time is uncovered and then becomes a point of dispute with Isaac's servants and Abimelech's servants and shepherds. And so they move on to the next one until finally the dispute over wells is resolved. And then Abimelech visits Isaac to make an oath of peace with him towards the end of the chapter. And the chapter ends then with two short verses, as I've alluded to earlier, from the priestly source, letting the reader know that one, Esau has married two Hittite women, and two, that these wives made life bitter for Isaac and Rebekah. Before we move on, I'd like to read Isaac's words upon his reunion with Abimelech after the dispute over the wells. Verse 27 reads, Isaac said to them, "Why have you come to me, seeing that you hate me and have sent me away from you?" I'd like to touch back on a conversation that we ended with last week, and one that Sue, you wrote in an email some musings about, which is this word hate and what it might mean when Paul quotes in Romans that I have loved Jacob, but have hated Esau. And last week I said that there, I think, was something lost in the translation from the Old Hebrew, made its way through the Greek and into our English. And I'd like to expand on that, because my intuition was correct, although I didn't really have the detailed answer at the time. So this word hate that we see in this verse that I just read, chapter 26, verse 27, where Isaac is describing the way that Abimelech feels towards him, is the same word used in Malachi chapter 1, verses 2 through 3, which reads, "Yet I have loved Jacob, but have hated Esau." This is the very passage referenced in the Christian scriptures in Romans 9:13, which reads, "As it is written," it being written in Malachi, "I have loved Jacob, but have hated Esau." Before we move on, I will remind you that when these names are used in this way, the writer is talking about the nations that they represent. So in the case of Jacob, Israel; in the case of Esau, the Edomites. Also, our modern understanding of this word hate does obfuscate what is intended here. The Hebrew word used here is saneh, and it does not carry the emotionally charged feelings that we associate with the word hate, the English word hate, which is laden with feelings of resentment, loathing, contempt. Rather, it describes a moving away from or a rejection of a person, nation, or object. To use a very minor example, we still use this word. We still use the word hate in a similar way sometimes. For example, if my daughter told me that she hated olives, now she doesn't loathe olives. She doesn't have them in contempt. She doesn't want to exact vengeance on olives. Generally speaking, she doesn't feel powerfully about it at all. she really is saying she wants those objects, that food item, away from her. She wants nothing to do with it. She rejects it. Leah uses this very word, same word, to describe her status within her marriage in Genesis chapter 29. She conceived again and bore a son and said, because the Lord has heard that I am hated, he has given me also this son. And she named him Simeon. Now, if you read the story, you don't get the impression that Jacob loathes Leah, that Jacob holds her in contempt, that Jacob wishes her really any kind of ill will. But he definitely does reject her, set her apart, and push her away. And that is the way that the word functions in the Hebrew. You can also remember the story of Jacob's enmity between he and Esau. That, as I said earlier, it's meant to symbolize the greater struggle between Israel and Edom. More specifically, it's meant to highlight the differences between cultures of idolatry and violence, as symbolized by the people of Edom in Israel's larger narrative, when compared to a culture of proper worship that seeks justice and rejects violent ways, which Israel is meant to represent at its best. So when Paul quotes Malachi in Romans 9:13, he is doing so to help us better understand the God who hates, in other words, rejects, moves away from violence and exploitation, as embodied mythically in the story of Esau / Edom, and loves, conversely, in other words, gravitates and moves towards the ways of faithfulness and peace, as embodied in the story of Jacob or Israel. Now, later we will read about Esau being filled with hatred. And the Hebrew word there is different, and we'll get to that when it comes up. And we'll see that the word hatred, translated into English as hatred later, that the hatred that Esau holds for his brother at the end of the story does, in fact, evoke these feelings of contempt and need for revenge and what we would call maybe despising someone. But it's a different Hebrew word. And so, case in point of how much is often lost in our translations from one language to another. That being said, after that segue, we will now turn to the story, which picks up in chapter 27 of the book of Genesis, which reads, when Isaac was old and his eyes were dim, so that he could not see, he called his elder son Esau and said to him, my son. And he answered, here I am. He said, see, I am old. I do not know the day of my death. Now then, take your weapons, your quiver, and your bow, and go out to the field and hunt game for me. Then prepare for me savory food, such as I like, and bring it to me to eat, so that I may bless you before I die. A few words on blessing. I'm not going to read all of this because as I was practicing this earlier, I determined that this is too long a quote to read, but I can make the point by reading parts of it. Blessings are imparted by persons who possessed blessings themselves, usually persons in authority, such as the priest, the king, or the head of a family. It is effective when uttered by these categories of persons because of their positions and status in the society. Isaac, as the head of the family, had this singular privilege to bless his son. Besides being the head of his family, he was also blessed by God. As someone blessed and possessing blessing, he could evoke God's blessing and transmit it to another. And picking up on the right side of the screen, the second part of the quote. The contents of the blessings include the gift of fertility, which can be of land, animals, and human beings, well-being, and victory over the enemies. These were also Isaac's wishes for his son. He prayed for the dew of heaven that makes fatness of the earth possible, exemplified in plenty of grain and wine. Dominion over peoples and nations could form part of well-being that is included in the abundance of harvest. Victory over the enemies can be deduced from the formula of the curse at the end of Isaac's blessing. Cursed be everyone who curses you. So all this to say, blessings were things that were conveyed by the one who was in the right place of authority to give the blessing, in this case Isaac as the patriarch, to the right and proper son, in this case is meant to be Esau, or traditionally the eldest son of the chief wife. The story continues. Now, Rebekah was listening when Isaac spoke this to Esau. So when Esau went to the field to hunt for game and bring it, Rebekah said to her son Jacob, I heard your father say to your brother Esau, bring me game and prepare for me savory food to eat, that I may bless you before the Lord before I die. Now, therefore, my son, obey my word as I command you. Go to the flock and get me 2 choice kids, so that I may prepare from them savory food for your father, such as he likes. And you shall take it to your father to eat, so that he may bless you before he dies. But Jacob said to his mother Rebekah, look, my brother Esau is a hairy man, and I am a man of smooth skin. Perhaps my father will feel me, and I shall seem to be mocking him, and bring a curse on myself and not a blessing. His mother said to him, let your curse be on me, my son. Only obey my word and go. Get them for me. Subterfuge, deceit, plot making. Rebekah plots to enable Jacob to receive the blessing in Esau's stead. Remember, we know that Rebekah loves Jacob over Esau, and Isaac loves Esau over Jacob. We read that in our last week's lesson in chapter 25. Favoritism is already a factor. Also, it could be that Rebekah has the echo of the oracle made in 25 verse 23 echoing in her mind, an oracle prophesying Jacob's ascendancy over his brother. Or perhaps, and this is all speculation, perhaps she is angry at Esau's marriages to the Hittite women that we just read caused bitterness between Esau and his parents. Either way you cut it, the plan laid before us is deceptive and morally dubious. Jacob seems to think so as well and offers some tacit objections. In fact, he fears a curse. Rebekah is so determined, she is willing to bear whatever fate may befall them if the plot fails. Before we move on, I'll call your attention to the picture here. I could find no pictures of this story that cast these characters in ways that were actually historically fitting. This is in the Near East or Middle East. This story would portray them as persons from Ireland or Scotland or Germany. This is not the way they would have looked, and not to mention the way that they're dressed. This is very medieval or Western European. But this is the only pictures I could find of the story. And I looked and I looked and I looked, which is usually not the case with other biblical stories. I'm usually able to find some that are more in keeping with the actual people that these stories would have been about. But just as an aside, I point that out. It goes on. So he went and got to them and brought them to his mother, and his mother prepared savory food, such as his father loved. Then Rebekah took the best garments of her elder son Esau, which were with her in the house, and put them on her younger son Jacob. And she put the skins of the kids on his hands and on the smooth part of his neck. Then she handed the savory food and the bread that she had prepared to her son Jacob. Now, in this next passage, I underlined every question that is asked of, or every question or comment that is made by Isaac, and then I have put in bold every answer of deceit that Jacob will give in this next part. Verse 18. So he went in to his father and said, my father. And he said, here I am. Who are you, my son? Jacob said to his father, I am Esau, your firstborn. I have done as you told me. Now sit up and eat of my game, so that you may bless me. But Isaac said to his son, how is it that you have found it so quickly, my son? He answered, because the Lord your God granted me success. When Isaac said to Jacob, come near that I may feel you, my son, then Isaac said to Jacob, come near that I may feel you, my son, to know whether you are really my son Esau or not. So Jacob went up to his father Isaac, who felt him and said, the voice is Jacob's voice, but the hands are the hands of Esau. He did not recognize him because his hands were hairy like his brother Esau's hands. So he blessed him. He said, are you really my son Esau? He answered, I am. Here is deception of the highest order. If one were to ask you if it was morally right to deceive a blind old man, not to mention your father, in order to produce blessing intended for another, how would you answer? In any other instance, the answer would clearly be no. These are not morally upright actions. However, when biblical heroes behave in these ways, we routinely give them a pass. The question is, should we? Or need we? Note in verse 20, when Isaac asks how it is that his son has returned from the hunt in such good time, Jacob replies, because the Lord your God, in other words, Yahweh Elohim, invokes the name of God, granted me success. He invokes the holy name Yahweh in order to bolster his deceit. Surely this is what it means to use the Lord's name in vain. Verse 25. Then he said, bring it to me, that I may eat of my son's game and bless you. So he brought it to him, and he ate. And he brought him wine, and he drank. Then his father Isaac said to him, come near and kiss me, my son. So he came near and kissed him. And he smelled the smell of his garments and blessed him and said, ah, the smell of my son is like the smell of a field that the Lord has blessed. May God give you the dew of heaven and of the fatness of the earth and plenty of grain and wine. Let people serve you and nations bow down to you. Be Lord over your brothers, and may your mother's sons bow down to you. Cursed be everyone who curses you, and blessed be everyone who blesses you. So the blessing is conferred. We will learn later that this blessing is inconvertible. Once the blessing is given, it cannot be taken back. The plot has come off without a hitch. Verse 30. As soon as Isaac had finished blessing Jacob, when Jacob had scarcely gone out from the presence of his father Isaac, his brother Esau came in from his hunting. He also prepared savory food and brought it to his father. And he said to his father, let my father sit up and eat of his son's game, so that you may bless me. His father Isaac said to him, who are you? He answered, I am your firstborn son, Esau. Then Isaac trembled violently and said, who was it then that hunted game and brought it to me? And I ate it all before you came, and I have blessed him. Yes, and blessed he shall be. Question. Which of the sons has been obedient and truthful? A rhetorical question, of course. While Jacob and his mom are hatching their plot, Esau is out in the wilderness doing what his father asked. He returned and cooks up a meal to his father's liking with his own hands. Remember, Jacob's meal was prepared by his mother. Back in chapter 25, when Esau was robbed of his birthright, one might make the case that Esau was short-sighted or even slightly complicit in Jacob's dealings. Here, we can cast no such aspersions. He has done nothing wrong. In fact, he has done everything right. Also, some have speculated that perhaps Isaac was in on the dealings. Some have noticed that he seems particularly aloof, or at least he questions whether or not this son is in fact Esau, raising questions as to his voice. He seems to have layers of skepticism that are really only thrown off towards the end when he smells his son and smells the field because he's wearing Esau's clothes. But some have thought that maybe Isaac being upset at the fact that Esau has married two Hittite women that have caused bitterness between Esau and he and Rebekah. Maybe that is a reason. So people sometimes wonder if maybe Isaac knows more than he is letting on that he knows. But I think that verse 33 is meant to communicate to us, the reader, that this is not the case, that he really is duped and taken in a serious way. Because verse 33 reads, then Isaac trembled violently and said, who was it then, etc., etc. Trembled violently. He seems to be a man, upon the revelation that he has been tricked, to be undone and to be very troubled by what has happened. So I think that we are meant to believe that he is completely surprised by this revelation. Verse 34, when Esau heard his father's words, he cried out with an exceeding great and bitter cry and said to his father, bless me also, father. But he said, your brother came deceitfully, and he has taken away your blessing.
Esau said, "Is he not rightly named Jacob? For he has supplanted me these 2 times. He took away my birthright, and look, he has taken away my blessing." Then he said, "Have you not reserved a blessing for me?" So Jacob lives up to his name. He has indeed struck at Esau's heel whilst he was unawares, tripping him up and hamstringing his future. In desperation, Esau pleads with his father for a reserve blessing. Verse 37, Isaac answered Esau, "I have already made him your lord, and I have given him all his brothers as servants, and with grain and wine I have sustained him. What then can I do for you, my son?" I find this line interesting. As an aside, I find this interesting that he talks about his resources as if they are they can't be divided or dispersed in equal portion between his sons. Here he is reflecting his culture or his assumptions about how things are passed down, birthrights and such, in this case, blessing. Verse 38, Esau said to his father, "Have you only one blessing, father? Bless me also, father." And Esau lifted up his voice and wept. Then his father Isaac answered him, "See, away from the fatness of the earth shall your home be, and away from the dew of heaven on high. By your sword you shall live, and you shall serve your brother. But when you break loose, you shall break his yoke from your neck." Isaac in the story makes it clear that he has only one blessing to bestow, at least one blessing of the magnitude of the one given to Jacob. However, in response to Esau's lament, Isaac speaks words that strike the reader as rather bleak, but with perhaps some silver lining. Handel writes in the commentary in my NRSV Bible, my Harper's Collins NRSV Bible, Isaac's equivocal pronouncement is more a curse than a blessing, locating Esau away from fertility and under Jacob's rule, the inverse of Jacob's blessing. Like Ishmael, his life will be violent. "You shall break his yoke from your neck." This ray of hope probably refers to Edom's successful revolt against Judah in the mid-9th century BCE after a period of Judean hegemony. This is to remind us that this story, as interpreted later, was meant to explain how Israel related to their neighbor Edom. And Edom did win their independence from underneath Judea's rule eventually. And it is thought that this last line about Esau breaking the yoke from his neck is an allusion to that. Verse 41. Now Esau hated Jacob because of the blessing with which his father had blessed him. And Esau said to himself, "The days of mourning for my father are approaching. Then I will kill my brother Jacob." But the words of her elder son Esau were told to Rebekah. So she sent and called her younger son Jacob and said to him, "Your brother Esau is consoling himself by planning to kill you. Now therefore, my son, obey my voice. Flee at once to my brother Laban in Haran, and stay with him a while, until your brother's fury turns away, until your brother's anger against you turns away, and he forgets what you have done to him. Then I will send and bring you back from there. Why should I lose both of you in one day?" Before I go into the next part, I will just say that there is no biblical record of Rebekah reuniting with Jacob. I have emboldened the word here translated as hated in order to point out that the Hebrew word here used is different than the one discussed at the opening of this lesson, which was sene. The word here is satam, which does, in fact, evoke the sense of loathing and emotive anger that our modern English word hate carries with it, as is manifest in Esau's subsequent words and actions. And so this is a hatred that burns from they would have thought, the seat of their affections, which was their stomach. We would say our heart, our core, the kind of hatred that leads to acts of vengeance and acts of violence. This is the kind of hatred that Esau is embodying as a result of Jacob's actions and his mother's actions, if we're to be quite honest. So Esau pledges to kill his brother. Rebekah runs defense and instructs him to leave. She is now faced with a reckoning for her actions. Her favorite son is forced to leave her. Verse 45 indicates that Rebekah does, in fact, care for Esau after a fashion. Handel writes, her plan, moreover, saves the lives of both sons, since Esau would have been executed as a murderer, and she does not want to lose both in one day. So, some takeaways. I could have made many of the same takeaways that we had at last week's lesson, but I didn't want to repeat. But I will just say that in many ways, these players in the story are acting in light of their cultural assumptions about firstborn sons, about who is preferred and who is secondary. We mentioned how Abraham had several other children in addition to Isaac that he sent away, Ishmael being one of them, but then many other besides. And you can imagine the sorts of resentments and angers and inequalities that this would cultivate. I can make all of the same points again, and I think that they apply to today's story. But actually, I would like today's story to serve as a leaping off point into future stories about many of these same characters. We should refrain today from coming to final conclusions as to the moral rectitude of the characters in the story. Overall, I think we should hold a light to what they did in this story and have our own commentary. As I've said, who can defend Jacob's actions or even Rebekah's actions here, deceiving husband and father with outright lies, even invoking the name of Lord God to shore up the lie. Right? We can't. That's fairly indefensible. But as we will discover, their stories are just beginning, and their character arcs are incomplete from the vantage point of today's story. However, we can and should reflect on the actions of these characters in the story as they are revealed in this chapter of their lives. Rebekah, a mother who plays favorites and plots against her eldest son and husband. Jacob, a son who is willing to lie bold-faced to his father, even evoking the name of his father's God to shore up the lie. A man who is willing to trick his brother out of his lawful inheritance and father's blessing. Esau, a man who lost what was rightfully his, twice deceived and robbed, a man whose anger burned white hot and who, like Cain before him, sought to spill his brother's blood. And Isaac, who, if we just took from today's story, is an old man tricked and used by those around him. But as we will discover, their characters are not set in stone. The cement is still wet. I'd like to conclude today's stories by reading some reflections from one of my favorite preachers and authors, Frederick Buechner. And his reflections on these characters are fun to read, even if they don't fit everything that we've been talking about in terms of his interpretation of the story. I think that his poetic way of writing of these characters really humanizes them and brings them into more relatable form. And so I'm going to read excerpts from his reflections on these characters in the order that they appear in today's story. Starting with Isaac. He writes, Isaac was on the verge of a second childhood and almost blind when his son Jacob conned him into thinking he was his other son Esau, so that he could get the old man's blessing and the lion's share of the estate when that time came. Isaac had a hunch there was something fishy going on and called the young man over to be sure. The young man said he was Esau, but it was in Jacob's voice that he said it. Isaac couldn't trust his hearing all that much better than his eyesight, however, so he told him to let him touch him with his hands. Esau's hands were hairy, and he knew he'd know them anywhere, but Jacob had seen that coming, and Isaac wasn't sure whether what he felt were Esau's hairy hands or a pair of bearskin gloves. In fact, there was so little he could be sure of anymore, he thought, and he felt so old and hopeless and dumb that he almost didn't care by then which son it was, if he'd only stopped badgering him. He sent out for a drink and a sandwich, which revived him a little, and then with a sudden rush of emotion, his all but useless eyes welling with tears, he reached out, pulled the young man to him, and kissed him. Clover and Timothy, black earth, horse manure, rain. His ears and his eyes were all shot, he thought, but he couldn't even tell what he was touching half the time, what with his bad circulation. But at least he still had a nose that worked, and by now the lump in his throat was so big he could hardly get the words out of his mouth. See, the smell of my son is as the smell of the field which the Lord has blessed, he said, And then, not caring whether it was Esau or Jacob or Napoleon Bonaparte, who was there on his knees before him, he gave out with a blessing that made all the other blessings he'd ever given sound like 2 cents. That's Isaac. Esau was so hungry he could hardly see straight when his younger twin Jacob bought his birthright for a bowl of chili. He was off hunting rabbits when Jacob conned their old father Isaac into giving him the blessing that should have been Esau's by right of primogeniture. Eventually, it dawned on Esau what his brother was up to, and he went slogging after him with a blunt instrument. But the slowness of his wits was compensated for by the generosity of his disposition, and in time, the two were reconciled. Jacob stole Esau blind, in other words, got away with it, and went on to become the father of the 12 tribes of Israel. It was not all gravy, however. He knew famine and loss. He grieved for years over the supposed death of his favorite child. He was as hoodwinked by his own sons in this as both his father and Esau had been hoodwinked by him, and he died with the clamor of their squabbling shrill in his ears. Esau, on the other hand, though he'd lost his shirt, settled down in the hill country, raised a large, if comparatively indistinguished family, and died in peace. Thus, it seems hard to know which of the two brothers came out ahead in the end. It seems plain, however, that the reason God bypassed Esau and made Jacob heir to the great promise is that it is easier to make a silk purse out of a sow's ear than out of a dim bulb. Gotta say, that's harsh. Rebecca. Rebecca's marriage to Isaac was a family arrangement rather than a love match, and all the love she had in her to give she seems to have lavished on her son Jacob. When she overheard old Isaac say that he was going to give Jacob's twin brother Esau the paternal blessing that made him his heir, she was almost beside herself. She ran and told Jacob what was up and said he'd better get to Isaac before Esau did, or Esau would get the blessing and everything that went with it, and Jacob wouldn't get a blessed thing. Jacob objected that, blind as Isaac was, he would still be able to tell the brothers apart because Esau was a hairy man, whereas he, Jacob, had all he could do just to raise a toothbrush mustache. Just one touch, Jacob said, and the old duffer would know that something fishy was going on. Rebecca thought fast, and after dressing Jacob up in one of Esau's best suits, produced some bearskin gloves for him to put on his hands and an extra pelt to wrap around his neck. The trick worked beautifully. Isaac thought it was Esau kneeling before him, and Jacob carried the day. When the cat was finally out of the bag, Esau first burst into tears and then announced that by the time he got through with Jacob, not even his mother would recognize him. But again, Rebecca thought fast. She told Jacob what his brother had in mind and persuaded him to get out of town while he could still walk. Jacob took the advice, and the bitter irony of it is that if Rebecca ever saw the apple of her eye again, it is at least not so recorded. It is also not recorded when or where or in what state of mind Rebecca finally died, but there is a note to the effect that when the time came, they buried the lonely old woman in a cave in Machpelah. Years later, Jacob was buried there too, and if she had any way of knowing about it, one can imagine her happy at least to be lying there side by side with the beloved boy for whose sake she had betrayed not only Isaac, her husband, and Esau, her son, but God himself, in whose name the fateful blessing had been given. And lastly, Jacob. The book of Genesis makes no attempt to conceal the fact that Jacob was, among other things, a crook. What's more, you get the feeling that whoever wrote up his seamy adventures got a real kick out of them. Twice he cheated his lame-brained brother Esau out of what was coming to him. At least once he took advantage of the blindness of his old father Isaac and played him for a sucker. He outdid his double-crossing father-in-law Laban by conning him out of most of his livestock, and later on, when Laban was looking the other way, by sneaking off not only with both the man's daughters, but just about everything else that wasn't nailed down, including his household gods. Jacob was never satisfied. He wanted the moon, and if he'd ever managed to bilk heaven out of it, he would have been back the next morning for the stars to go with it. But then one day he learned a marvelous lesson in a marvelous and unexpected way. And there, because we're going to pick up on the life of Jacob and the journey that he will be on to discover, if not a complete transformation, a real change in many aspects of his character. And if you read on, you will know even reconciliation to his brother who he had so sorely wronged. So that is all I have prepared. I'll bring it back to the group for comments and questions.
Are we to believe that the birthright and the blessing are the same, or is there a distinction there?
They're different. The blessing, the biblical commentators either lean into the feeling that you get that it's something like, I want to use a better word than spell. It's something that when spoken, it brings about a new reality. And because the patriarch is given the rights and the privileges to bestow the blessing, as was presumably bestowed on him, he has the ability to pass that seemingly intangible thing on that manifests in an abundance of crops, an abundance of prosperity, an abundance of every good thing. The birthright is the contractual, the contract that the oldest son of the chief wife has for the possessions, blessing or no. So
Okay.
you could have imagined it working like this. If Jacob had only stolen the blessing, then Esau would have inherited the family farm, but by means of, I guess, as so fate would have it, Jacob would find himself falling into blessing after blessing after blessing, enemies of Jacob failing, and so on and so on. That's the idea. So they are two different. They are two different things.
Okay.
So that kind of leads me to another question. And we may have talked about this before, and I've lost track of it, but what happens to the chief wife when the husband dies? So if Abraham dies before, or Isaac dies before Rebecca, what happens to her?
Well, by the time this was written, the Levitical code was also written in Numbers and Deuteronomy, and there are prescriptions as to what is supposed to happen to the wives of somebody who dies. And basically, they go on to the next eldest brother. So me and my brother often, Kelly will make a joke, like, biblically speaking, if he dies, I get all of the stuff. It's an inside family joke where it's like, get out of here. It's like they would.
So the mother, you're talking about the mother. So Rebecca would go to Jacob or Esau. So is that what you're saying?
Well, it's hard to know what to do with these stories that predate the Torah. Now, those reading these stories would have known that the Levitical law given to Moses on the mountain, as the story would tell it, gave the next eldest brother in the family. So it would have been Isaac's brother.
Isaac's brother. I see. Okay. And to take care of, or are they shunned and left by the side of the road to
take
die of
care
starvation?
of, as their in fact spouse. There's even a story.
Okay.
Perhaps Sue could help me with this, because you tend to know these things. There's a story about a brother who would not take up these responsibilities. Was it the story
Hamor.
of, I don't want to, what's that? Hamor, yeah, that's where she actually dresses as a prostitute to lure her brother-in-law upon her husband's death into a sexual relationship, and she becomes pregnant. And the story goes that he, thinking she's a prostitute because she's wearing a veil, she steals several of his household items that would have only been recognizable by him. And then she is found to be pregnant, and he is outraged because this is his sister-in-law, and he's wanting to cast aspersions. And then she goes, well, the man who's responsible is whoever owns these things. And he sees that she owns these things, that they're his, and the cat's out of the bag. And so he takes her as a spouse, as he was supposed to have done from the onset. And
I thought it was it's the brothers that were supposed to marry. And isn't he the father?
he was the father of her child, but she had been his sister-in-law. But her husband died, is my recollection of the story. And so she was, we'll have to go back and look, but whatever it is, he had a legal obligation to take her on as wife. And he was not meeting that legal obligation. And so she tricks him into fulfilling his obligation as was prescribed by the Levitical codes. That's is that right? So you may look it up and make sure we're getting.
Well, yeah, I don't think she stole the things. He was to pay her and he didn't have it with him. So she said, give me your staff
You got
and
it.
something else, I believe.
Got it.
And so he did. And then he sent the animal, I believe it was an animal, to look for the prostitute or Tamar and couldn't find her. And then when they found out she was pregnant, that's when she presented the staff to him and said,
got it.
this belongs to the father.
You got it. You got
So-
it. That's the story.
So,
And,
so sometimes when sorry.
No, you go ahead.
Sometimes when I look at these stories, I wonder, which came first. It doesn't really matter. But if you think it's historical that there were these two brothers and there was this strife, well, which came first, the outcome that there were the Israelites and the Edomites, and there was strife between the brothers that founded those lines. And so they needed a reason for the strife. And so then they threw Rebecca into the mix, or so they created a story around the outcome, or was this the legitimate story? So it's kind of interesting to me to think about,
That's
was there that story that was passed down from generation to generation, or was there this outcome? And so then they wove a story that was consistent with their values that made sense to them. And it's just interesting to think about for me.
it's only our modern minds are put in these times, really in the last couple hundred years, that really cared about that question. It's a good question from my vantage point too, because I'm wanting to know if you're going to tell me a story about John F. Kennedy, did it in fact happen, and says who, and if you record it decades after the fact, then I'm wanting to know, even if the story about him has some valid points about right ways to live, did it happen? That's what I want to know. Back then, before history became a discipline, the point was, what does the story teach you about your identity as a person here and now? And so I guess the historicity of the persons involved was assumed, but even if the function of the story is to explain how you are a neighbor to the Edomites and why things are the way they are, that's about where the conversation stopped. I'm not saying the question's wrong either. I've just this would not have been a question that bothered those who finally put it down to paper and then later compiled it into the Torah. But for sure, they were. It's an oral tradition passed down. How long?
And I was trying to wonder, why would a mother choose one son over the other? I mean, she was talking about being irritated by these Hittite wives, but is that a reason to sell out one of your sons? I mean,
Remember that he stayed in the tent with her. He was more her personality.
you sure?
And not to mention, God said the younger's going to rule over the oldest. So she's probably got things in her mind. God said this, it's going to happen, and I probably ought to help and do whatever I can to make it true. So I think it's a matter of personalities more so than anything else.
Just sort of sets up the Manchurian Candidate mother.
Yeah. Well, that could be in fact the author's explanation for why things are the way they are. So trying to resurrect the character of an historical person named Rebecca is it's impossible to really get there. All we have is a story written in the time, put that paper, compiled in a time of exile after the Edomites have broken the yoke from Judea, but is helping the people living in exile understand their sense of identity and their place. It's a foundational. These are the foundational stories to help legitimate history, failings of history. When we get to someday, we'll get to 1st and 2nd Samuel, where you can see several pivots, where Saul is made forever king, and then David is made forever king, and then you even need to bring Samuel up from the dead as kingmaker for a new chapter. Like you and when you realize that you're dealing in the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel with the same as today's story in the Torah, a variety of source materials with an awareness of what in fact actually happened. With pro-David factions and some passages that were written by somebody who clearly thought Saul was great. It's the same sort of thing going on in today's story. I'm not sure anyone probably reading it originally or putting it together cared much about whether we thought well of Rebecca.
Mm.
I mean, she had Esau's suit in her tent. It's a point I didn't point out earlier. She's like, she's thinking about this. She's in Jacob, you could say, learned it, given the narrative of this story, taking that for what it is, and dealing with the psychology of the characters within the framework of the story. They really are,
And I believe Rebecca never saw him again. So she had her beloved son was gone and never got. It's almost like he died that day because she never saw him again. All she had was past memories of it. So she suffered a loss for what she did.
Mm-hmm. She did. Yeah. There's no biblical recording of her ever reuniting with Jacob.
Guess that was her punishment.
Kind of tough. I did say in the conclusion that these character arcs will find, especially with Jacob and Esau, more. It's a bit like I was thinking of David again in the back of my mind, where people are wanting to take all the David stories and shoehorn them into David that is just great, just this fantastic guy. And you don't have to do that. You can look at overarching themes. You can see their lives like everyone's lives that has seasons of struggle, times where we do things where we wish we hadn't done the way we'd done it. We don't want to be judged by those moments. And then, things, Jacob hasn't wrestled with God yet. Let's put it that way. And not to say it's going to all turn out great, but it definitely, the story doesn't end here. However, as I'm saying that, I'm thinking of Rebecca here, where really this is her final act. And what a way to go down. Well, if everyone is had their say, we'll conclude this lesson. Continue to read on into 28 and 29. You'll hear as we go through these. I love the stories that are coming up. I think that the stories that are coming up are either really interesting and a lot of fun, or are very deep and rich with meaning, and many times both. I especially like what's coming up with the way that Jacob leaves Laban's with a larger flock, and the rationale behind how he gets the larger flock.
Mm-hmm.
But I won't say more than that. I just think it's just kind of
clever.
No, I'm about to.
That's payback. That's payback to Laban for the way he was treated.
Yeah.
Well, the motive is one thing. The methodology is the other thing that cracks me up. You, um, you put the goats in front of something that's spotted, and then they will make spotted babies.
Uh-huh.
We know that doesn't work, but that's what he does, and he's it really shows. Maybe they didn't quite know as much about genetics. They knew one of his methods works in spades, and it actually, people who breed animals know that that if you pick out the strongest animal for breeding, you'll get better results, even if they're not the preferred color. But the other one is he puts them in front of a plant that's spotted, and because they're looking at the idea I'm left with is the idea is you're looking at things that are spotted, and this is where they are procreating in front of spotted things, and then they come out speckled. And that's funny to me. I think I'm not even making fun of. I think I love that part of the story. It's just.
I think that's just God.
Hmm.
That's just God.
Well, we'll pick up on that story in the coming weeks.
Okay.
And God bless you all, and have a good rest of your day.
Mhm.
Hi.
See you
Bye-bye.
Sunday.
See you
Yep.
Sunday.